All right, everyone, we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you, everyone, for being here today for our first Science on Tap that is back on site. We are thrilled. So this is a hybrid event. We also have folks that are joining us online. So welcome to those folks that are online. We're happy to have you able to join us as well. My name is Cinnamon Moffett. I'm the research program manager here at Oregon State University's Hatfield Marine Science Center, located in Newport, Oregon. I will be your host for this evening. We also have Roseanne, that is a volunteer. Yay, thank you, Roseanne. She is monitoring and supporting folks that are online. So if you have any technical issues, go ahead and put it into chat and Roseanne will assist you or let me know that you're having issues. She will also be monitoring questions. So for those folks that are online, you do not have control over your mics, cameras, or screen share, but we do hope that you put in your questions into the chat and we'll work through those at the end of tonight's presentation. For those folks in the room, a couple of logistics. The restroom, now that I made you quickly drink your alcohol, is around the corner, kind of underneath the stairs. So you'll have to leave and come around, but that's where those are at. The other thing you should know is we are in a tsunami inundation zone. So if you feel shaking, you're gonna go out the doors and up the ramp. And I say that because I just wanna do a little promo. Next month's seminar for Science on Tap will be June 22nd, and it's gonna be the science behind the maps, taking a look at the tsunami inundation maps and how they were made and built and changed and updated. So I hope you come back and we'll do that event on June 22nd. So for those folks that are in the room, if you do have questions at the end, please either raise your hand and I'll bring you a mic or go to the mic that I have that's kind of up in that corner. We do need you to ask questions on a mic so that folks online can hear. So that's kind of how we'll work through that. I also wanted to just let everybody know that this is being recorded. So if you wanted to share it with others, it will be posted on the past seminar page in a few days. So feel free to take a look at that. And if you are curious about any of our events, you can go to HMSC's homepage and scroll to the bottom of that main page, and there's a calendar of events there that has information about all of our events and how to get involved either on site or online. But why we're all here is for tonight's speaker. So I just wanted to do a quick introduction of Dr. Scott Baker. Scott Baker is the lead researcher for the Cetacean Conservation and Genomics Lab and is the Associate Director of the Marine Mammal Institute at Oregon State University's Hatfield Marine Science Center here. He has his bachelor's in environmental science from New College in the University of South Florida and a PhD in zoology from the University of Hawaii. Scott is broadly interested in whale and dolphin evolution and ecological pattern and processes. He is particularly interested in projects that bring together molecular and demographic approaches to improve conservation of the species. So I'm going to hand it off to Scott, who will take it away. Make sure you turn your mic on and I'll turn the lights off.
Thank you, Cinnamon. And thanks to Bob Cowan, Director of HMSC, for the invitation to come and talk to you a little tonight about an amazing place. South Georgia is one of the most starkly beautiful places on Earth. And prior to the advent of modern commercial whaling in 1904, it was also the center of an almost unbelievable diversity and abundance of whales and wildlife. Following that advent of commercial, industrial, modern exploitation, it also suffered an almost unbelievable slaughter of those whales. And it's now in a state 60 years on of potential recovery. And that's what I'd like to talk to you about this evening. So let's start with a little geography. Where are we? Well, it's not driving distance from Atlanta. It's a pretty hard place to get to. I flew from PDX to LAX and LAX to Santiago. You must overnight in Santiago. Then you fly on to Punta Arenas, where you get off the plane and on the plane. And then you fly on to the Falkland Islands. And the Falkland Islands is typically the port of call or the port of departure for most travel to South Georgia. The only alternate to this route is through the Royal Air Force out of the UK. And that's an 18-hour flight, I think, with a break in Cape Verde. So you can pick your poison there. South Georgia is another 800 nautical miles. And so just to remind you, this is not your wimpy little kilometers. This is 800 nautical miles from the Falkland Islands across what is typically a pretty rough patch of ocean. South Georgia and the South Sandwich Islands are part of the British Overseas Territories. They're administered by the governor of the Falkland Islands in Stanley. There are no resident human populations on either of these sets of islands, and there's no air travel. There is a small contingent of researchers that spent overwinters on South Georgia, but they are not residents, so there's no domestic governance at all. They are at about 54 to 55 degrees south latitude, but are considered south of the Antarctic convergence. So they are actually part of the Antarctic rather than the subantarctic, or at least by most standards. And there is, of course, a disputed claim of sovereignty with Argentina. And in fact, Argentina invaded South Georgia very briefly during the 1982 conflict between Argentina and the UK. There is a flag commemorating the fur seal and the macaroni penguin. It's quite a handsome flag, I think. There is a post office on South Georgia, and stamps commemorating living whales are particularly popular. I wouldn't call it express mail. I sent here, I think, a postcard to Debbie Steele, my senior technician in my laboratory, and I think it took 12 weeks to arrive, but it did arrive. And it is postage stamped, South Georgia. The research station is administered by the British Antarctic Survey, which is part of the National Environmental Research Council, or NERC. As I mentioned, South Georgia is a remote outpost for wildlife and a center of human exploitation. It is about 100 miles long and about 20 miles wide. Elevation is considerable, over 9,000 feet. And again, this is 9,000 feet direct from sea level, so it's quite impressive. It is glaciated year round, at least for now. There are seals, sea lions, penguins, and seabirds in the millions. And there's 7 former whaling stations, which you can see here in red. They're a little bit small. They're all on this north or east side of the island. And they have these wonderful names that sound like they came from Game of Thrones. Prince Olaf, Leith, Stromness, Husvik, Guddul, Grytviken, Ocean Harbor. How did Ocean Harbor sneak in there? That must have been a British outpost. I see them in the hundreds and thousands. Carl Anton Larsen, Arctic or a polar explorer, a Norwegian polar explorer and whaler, visited the South Georgia Islands as part of the Swedish Antarctic expedition of 1901 to 1903. He saw these whales, and the very next year established the whaling station at Grytviken with 60 men and 3 catching vessels. And he was most astounded at the diversity or the abundance of these rorqual whales. Fin whale here, blue whale here, and of course, humpback whales. These are species that had not been available to whalers during the classic period of what we call Yankee whaling, the time that we see commemorated in Moby Dick, for example. The moot point is whether Leviathan can long endure so wide a chase and so remorseless a havoc. So said Herman Melville in 1851, but he was thinking only of the right whale, the easy whales to kill, and the sperm whale. He had no idea about the abundance of the rorqual whales, the blue, the fin, and the humpback in the Southern Ocean. And here we see the onset of this industrial whaling at Grytviken in 1904. In fact, a few remnant right whales were taken, but the majority of whales early on, as we'll see, were humpback, blue, and fin. So here we see a blue whale of extraordinary length. If you see as a scale, here is one of the whalers preparing to flinch this incredible creature. This was the onset of a true century of slaughter. It wasn't just Grytviken and it wasn't just South Georgia. Over 2 million whales were killed in the Southern Hemisphere from 1904 to 1986. Including over 360,000 blue whales. South Georgia, though, did play a major part in this slaughter, recording 175,250 whales killed in this 60-year period. You can see that the largest number of those were the fin whales here at 87,000, but second to the blue whales at 41,000, humpbacks 26,000, sei whales 15,000, sperm whales 3,000, and others, including a few remnant right whales. We can see something here about the chronology and the pattern of serial exploitation or depletion. So we see humpbacks were the first primary target, probably because they were a moderate size and pretty easy to approach. And after just a few years, those largely disappeared and had to be replaced by blue and fin whales. We see that over a period of a few decades, the blue whales essentially disappeared and had to be replaced by fin whales and sei whales. And then toward the end, as all these populations were essentially disappearing, a shift to sperm whales until 1965, and the station, essentially there were no whales left to be taken and the station closed. It wasn't all blood and blubber. It was mostly blood and blubber. But Grytviken and South Georgia did have a role to play, a more edifying role to play in the heroic age of Antarctic exploration. And I think we'll have that age again as we increasingly turn our attention to the Southern Ocean and the changes in the environment in that area. So South Georgia is in many ways best known as the location of the destination of the self-rescue by Ernest Shackleton, whose ship, the Endurance, was crushed by ice. And he led a small group of men in an open whaling boat from Elephant Island on the Antarctic Peninsula, 800 nautical miles to South Georgia, where he came up on the wrong side of the island, and then was the first person to ever traverse across the island from where he landed to the whaling station of Stromness. So a remarkable journey for which he is justly considered a great hero. South Georgia is also a frequent port of call for the Royal Research vessel, or Royal Research ship Discovery II. This was one of the first vessels involved in systematic oceanographic and hydrological surveys of the Great Southern Ocean. And then now will be again a regular port of call for the Royal Research ship Sir David Attenborough. This is one of the most, I think we'd say, advanced polar exploring vessels available today. I think in a misguided attempt to enlist the public in enthusiasm for this $250 million ship, there was apparently a call on social media to have the public offer names and to vote. And the popular vote, the leading vote, was Bodie McBoatface. Some of you may remember this. It was sort of a classic example of what not to ask social media to do. Fortunately, cooler heads prevailed, as they say, and the Minister of Science took it upon himself to disregard the public's opinion. Although I'm told there is a automated underwater vehicle, AUV, am I saying that right, that has been named Bodie McBoatface, and quite appropriately, I'd say, from having seen the images. South Georgia is also, I think, a kind of a poster child example of the industrialization of the wild. The fact that you could go from essentially a starkly beautiful but entirely uninhabited island to nearly 3,000 men in those 7 whaling stations is a remarkable change in industrialization. So we see this as an early example of defaunation, that is the removal of the whales and the industrial development of the oceans. And we see here Leith Harbor in the mid-20s, and you can see an almost unbelievable, I counted and I'm not sure I got it all right. I think there are 24 killer vessels here. So each one of these is a steam-powered, coal-burning, whale hunting vessel. And now, after 40 or more years, nearly 60 years, Grytviken has been abandoned and is beginning to be restored as a refuge for wildlife and as a center for tourism of the Arctic or sub-Antarctic and sub-Antarctic. And you can see here Matt Ridley's piece from the Wall Street Journal about a determined effort to bring seals, fish, and penguins back to South Georgia Island. I think he's a little misguided in that interpretation. It's not really an effort to bring them back. It's an effort to quit killing them. And in fact, to leave it to benign neglect, to replenish the wildlife and to restore the wilderness. In a few cases, however, there is the requirement for a more active role in restoration. And one of those, and maybe one of the most extensive, is the elimination of all rodents, rats and mice, from South Georgia, the largest ever rat or pest eradication effort in history. And I want to commemorate or acknowledge a close colleague, Professor Tony Martin at the University of Dundee, who was largely in charge of this effort. And Tony, as we'll see, was also responsible for collecting bones of the whales from the shoreline and providing those to us for scientific research. This was a nearly 4-year project beginning in 2011, and then finally declared rat-free, that is, after 3 years of searching for rats or mice that might have escaped. It was declared truly pest-free in 2018. And since that time, apparently there's been a tremendous change in the reproductive success of many of the seabird species that were being preyed on by the rodents. So we see considerable recovery of the wilderness and recovery of the seabirds and wildlife now as a result of this benign neglect and to some extent a direct effort. But what about the recovery of whales? Well, we know, and just as an example of the incredible abundance of fin and blue whales, here we see the numbers of whales killed in a 261 square mile quadrant, really a 16 by 16 quadrant. I'm not sure why they chose that as a unit, but you can see here that there were hundreds, literally hundreds of fin whales and hundreds of blue whales taken in these quadrants, quite near to shore, quite near to the 7 whaling stations here, that within a day or less than a day's steaming. So we know there was a tremendous abundance before they were all extirpated. But what about now? Well, for many years, there really hasn't been very systematic information about the abundance of whales. But at Bird Island and at South Georgia Museum, they keep records of all the sightings. And you can see here from these 5-year periods that the primary species that's been observed was in fact right whales, a species that was actually not taken or not taken commonly as part of the industrial whaling of South Georgia, because the species had already been depleted from 19th century or Yankee whaling. So we see mostly right whales, which was kind of unexpected, a few humpback whales, Megaptera nova anglia, and a very few minke whales and a few killer whales. We see no reports, that is, no reports in 20 years of a fin or a blue whale, only a few humpback, and again, a sort of a surprising number of right whales. So we seemed that little had changed, that there had been a little recovery, and what recovery there had been was somewhat unexpected, that is, primarily in terms of an increased frequency of right whales. The International Whaling Commission has been quite involved in modeling these populations to give us a better understanding of their history of exploitation and their current abundance. And we see here what we refer to as a population dynamic model, but essentially it's a recreation of this history of whaling, starting with a pre-exploitation abundance of something between 200 and 300,000 whales. We know that now 340,000 were killed over this 40 or 50 year period before they were protected at around 1967, at which time it's estimated, and these are all estimates with quite a large degree of uncertainty, but we think that there were perhaps 395 Antarctic blue whales left. And this is not in South Georgia, this is 395 circumpolar, the whole species reduced to 395 individuals. The evidence is reasonably persuasive that that population has begun to grow slowly and may now number a little bit over 2,000. But this is an incredible reduction in the abundance of an incredibly important species in terms of the marine ecosystem. We see some contrasting information that's made it a little bit difficult to interpret some of these other results. But here we see one of these population dynamic models for the population of whales that breed off of Brazil, referred to by the IWC as breeding stock A. And again, based on a reconstruction, using catch information and assumptions about carrying capacity of the environment, that prior to exploitation, there were 23 to 31,000 humpback whales in this breeding population. And again, a very sharp decline due to very intensive hunting during the early part of the 20th century. And then a reduction to a few hundred whales, and now an actual fairly substantial recovery to more than 20,000. Now, this is on the breeding grounds, not the feeding grounds, although we assume that South Georgia was associated as a feeding ground with these breeding grounds. We see recovery on one habitat, but not another. Explanations for this, we could spend all evening probably thinking up various scenarios, but I think two kind of rise to importance for me, and in part because I think we can, to some extent, subject these to further investigation and hypotheses. One is a loss of migratory culture. And the prediction here is that you may have little recovery of a formerly abundant population until migratory destinations are reestablished, followed by an abrupt increase or pulse. So the information that the whales need about finding the habitat is lost because essentially that local population was extirpated. And so it creates a kind of a resistance to recovery until they rediscover that habitat. And we see some examples of this, or at least some examples that seem to be consistent with this interpretation. And I want to acknowledge one of my colleagues, Phil Clapham here, who summarized information on whaling history in this apparent cultural lag in regards to the temporal scale of management. And he referred to it as lessons from the whaling. Loss of genetic diversity is another potential. Here, the genetic diversity of a post-exploitation population will reflect loss of pre-exploitation diversity due to a population bottleneck, that is, reducing the population to so few individuals, we lose genetic diversity. And this prediction and this hypothesis is not mutually exclusive, it's not inconsistent with the first one. In fact, we know that much of the migratory culture of whales is likely to be transmitted generationally from the mother during early maternal experience. We also know that mitochondrial DNA is inherited strictly maternally, and so the loss of a migratory destination, of that maternal fidelity, will also influence the loss of mitochondrial DNA. So we have a way of assessing to some extent this loss of maternal culture in terms of migratory destinations. And we have a molecular archive of exploitation. I mentioned Tony Martin and his role in collecting samples of these bones that are cast up on the shore of South Georgia Island in the tens of thousands. It's remarkable, they're all still there. It's been more than 60 years since any whale was killed, and more than 100 years since many of the whales were killed, and yet the shorelines of many of these bays are still lined with these bones, these remnants. We also know that these bones are largely the result of the early years of exploitation before they became industrially proficient at using all of the product of a whale, including the bone. And this led us to think that perhaps we could estimate pre-exploitation genetic abundance using the bones of these great whales and compare them to contemporary diversity from whales that we've collected samples from non-lethally. So we have a lethal comparison from the whaling era and a non-lethal comparison from contemporary populations. And I want to acknowledge here my student Angie Zaremba, who finished her PhD just a few years ago, it seems, who has been remarkably successful extracting the DNA from these bones. And we're not going to go into much technical detail, but just to give you a sense of this now post-COVID, we're all a little bit more familiar with the polymerase chain reaction and some of the genetic and genomic methods we have available and how we can begin to apply these to wildlife and particularly our whales. Angie was provided with samples from 281 bones that Tony had collected when he was still with the British Antarctic Survey. And she drilled these bones and extracted the DNA and was able to amplify a little fragment of mitochondrial DNA, which is a marker that's sufficient for identifying the species with confidence and sometimes with information within a species, what we call intraspecific diversity or haplotypes. She was successful with identifying 231 of those 281, or about 82%, which is really quite remarkable, considering that she was working with what was essentially ancient DNA. And she was able to identify the species of those 231. 158 of them were humpback, 51 of them were fin, 18 were blue, 2 were say, 1 was a right whale, and 1 was an elephant seal. So we had pretty good evidence that, you know, she was getting information that was authentic. Certainly the elephant seal, we've never had elephant seal in our laboratory or been even anywhere near it. And she compared this then to the catch records of South Georgia on the assumption, or to answer the question about whether these bones reflected the early stages of whaling. And you can see here that this very good agreement between the frequency of these whales here from the South Georgia bones in comparison to the first decade of the hunt. So we have mostly humpback whales, which were essentially extirpated, eliminated after that first decade, and then fin, and then blue. And here in the bones, we have mostly humpback, then fin, then blue. So we can be reasonably confident that our sample of bones, in fact, came from that first decade of South Georgia whaling, in which case those whales represent pristine genetic diversity. Yes, we killed them, but they had never been hunted before, so their populations were, as I said, pristine. Now we had the information we need to look at pre-exploitation abundance, but what about that contemporary population, or what we need for the post-exploitation abundance? Well, that's pretty challenging too, because these whales, particularly the blue whale, are so rare now. That is, they're still so depleted that collecting samples has required an enormous effort and amount of time. The International Whaling Commission has supervised the collection of surveys of the Antarctic for the last 2 decades, now 3 decades. And during the 2 decades of that, we're able to collect 218 biopsy samples from blue whales around the Antarctic. None of those samples came from South Georgia. So again, we have a limitation in our scientific investigation. We can't make a direct before and after comparison the way we'd like to. So it's for this reason that I was pretty excited to be offered an opportunity to participate in a survey of, in fact, the 3rd year of a 3-year survey of wild water whales from South Georgia. And this was an effort initiated by my former postdoctoral fellow, Jennifer Jackson. Some of you who've been here for a while may remember Jen. She is now a marine polar geneticist, I think is her title, at the British Antarctic Survey, home based in Cambridge, United Kingdom. She and one of my former PhD students, Emma Carroll, some of you may also remember Emma, although she was enrolled at the University of Auckland, New Zealand, she spent a fair amount of time here. They were principal investigators on this remarkable 3-year study. And our objectives were to survey the whales and the prey, to collect biopsy samples, photo ID, and drone images, to satellite tag right whales and humpback whales. Unfortunately, no permit to tag the blue whales, to deploy sonobuoys for acoustic detections, to collect microbiomes from the spout samples and fecal samples from the other end of the whale. And for this, we had access to the research vessel Braveheart, a 140-foot former Japanese research vessel whose home port is currently in New Zealand. And it just turned out, not entirely by coincidence, that I was somewhat familiar with the owner and captain of the Braveheart and had been aboard her briefly years ago when we lived in New Zealand. And we had an international team of researchers, really a fantastic group of 10 individuals representing the UK, the US, Canada, Brazil, and New Zealand. We had 32 days at sea, covering more than 3,000 nautical miles total survey and transit. We departed the 6th of January, 2020 from the Falkland Islands, and I was well prepared. I had 150 doses of scopolamine for the seasickness. And you know, when you buy the scopolamine and you read the side effects and you go, oh yeah, sure, psychosis. Well, yes, indeed. If hallucinations qualify as psychosis, yeah, it does happen. So I've still got 149 of those lying around the house if anybody needs them. I'm not sure I recommend them. 4 days hard steaming brought us to South Georgia Island, where we spent from the 11th of January to the 2nd of February, and then returned on the 6th of February to Stanley and the Falkland Islands, and reversed our transit back to Portland. All hands on deck. This to give you a sense of what we were pretty busy the second we hit South Georgia. We had fantastic weather overall, and we had fantastic whales. And here you can see what the bow of the vessel looked like with biopsy darting with the crossbow, biopsy darting with the rifle, photo identification, a petri dish for blow samples. Sonobuoy monitoring was down in the salon, and we had a drone in the air, and there were observers on the flying bridge, and we satellite tagged from a rib, a rigid hull inflatable. So in fact, we had a lot going on almost all the time because it's light almost all the time. We completed 1,300 nautical miles of track lines around South Georgia, remarkably circumnavigating twice. Most people never attempt to even do any sightseeing or cruising on this west or south side of the island because it's much more exposed to the prevailing winds. But in fact, we had several days of very calm weather in which we were able to traverse the whole region here. And we actually traveled through, as I remember, I got to check back, the gap here with Bird Island, and we waved to Rachel Orban, who was down there studying seabirds, one of the members of our Marine Mammal Institute. We had whales everywhere. 519 sightings of groups of whales of 6 species: blue whales, fin whales, minke whales, humpback whales, right whales, killer whales. Nothing like what was there perhaps prior to hunting, but still a pretty remarkable abundance of whales from an area where just 20 years before, as we saw from those opportunistic records, there were no sightings. So we see it's mostly humpbacks, but quite a good scattering of blue, not very many right whales, and a few killer whales. We had nearly 1,000 individual whales, again, mostly humpbacks, but more blue whales than ever recorded in recent surveys. So we see here the total number of sightings, that is the encounters, but if the sightings included more than one individual, then we get the total number of individuals. So here, almost 1,000, 734 of which were humpbacks. And again, you can see here from this frequency distribution that it's more like that distribution of species in the first 10 years of the hunt, and more like what Angie was able to find from the bones as well. That is, the predominant species is humpback. Second most common actually would have been fin, probably, but also Antarctic blue whales and a scattering of southern right whales. We were able to collect, near and dear to my heart, 41 samples from 33 individuals from 3 species, including, I think, the first sample of a living blue whale from South Georgia. So although biopsy samples have been collected from Antarctic blue whales previously, I don't believe any of those had been actually in the waters of South Georgia itself. And of course, those are the ones we want for this direct before and after comparison. I could have gotten more if I hadn't missed a few, but that's the way it goes. We got 10 biopsy samples of at least 9 individuals of the blue whales. We had 19 out of 17, that is, we had some replicate samples of humpback whales, and we had 12 out of 7 individual southern right whales, including 2 of the right whales that we were able to tag with a satellite transmitter. 2 right whales named Anikoff and Braveheart were tagged with transmitters on the same day, 28th of January, and tracked for 115 days and 238 days respectively. And we'll come back and look at a little bit of this because it was quite an interesting track record. So, what have we learned with all this information now that it's been 2 years on? Not as much as we would have hoped, in part because we came back right at the outset of the pandemic. And much of the Antarctic research essentially closed down for a period of 2 years, including the transport vessel that was going to carry those genetic samples back up to the United Kingdom, where Jen was going to be able to analyze them and provide us with this information. All that is still in the works now, so after considerable delays. But despite that, there was a heroic effort by Amy Kennedy, who was our sort of chief scientist for the operation here, to be able to assemble all this information and make it available to the International Whaling Commission at their meeting later, just a few months later. I think that was in May of 2020 that she submitted that report. So we have quite a lot of information, but still a fair amount of interpretation to do. And I'm going to be fairly cavalier with some of my interpretations here in a minute. And I know I've got a few people who are going to bail me up, as they say, afterwards and complain about some of my hypotheses. But we learned a little bit about right whales. Here we are trying to tag, I learned it's actually pretty hard to satellite tag right whales. They're pretty evasive once they've been alerted to the presence of your vessel. But this is our rigid hull inflatable here with a pulpit, and this is Amy preparing to tag. So what we learned is that they do very different things, these right whales. So this right whale, Anikoff, was sampled here off Anikoff Bay, South Georgia, on the 28th of January, pretty much headed straight off to the south into the Scotia Sea and all the way down into the Weddell Sea. So down below well into the Antarctic. And we don't think about that as typical of right whales. So whether this is a response to climate change, exploration, just that our knowledge of right whales was incomplete, and this is standard practice, we don't know. The whale did, of course, eventually turn around and head back toward breeding grounds, heading back toward lower latitudes when the tag stopped here. Somewhat more amazing was Braveheart. Braveheart spent 5 months feeding around South Georgia, something more like what you would imagine as a result of fidelity to a specific feeding location. And then after the 5 months, traveled along the coast, bypassing Peninsula Valdez, which is the most renowned breeding ground for southern right whales, went right past that, up along the coast of Argentina, past Uruguay into southern Brazil, almost into the subtropics. Again, more extensive than we typically think of right whales, more subtropical, although there is a growing population of right whale breeding grounds here off of the southern Brazil. And then turned around, actually completed her migratory, his or her, we don't know the sex yet, and began traveling back south. So on their way, on his or her way back to the feeding grounds. Humpback whales. What can we say about humpback whales? Why are there so many of them when there seem to have been so few for so long? Well, I think in part it's that there's been a considerable period since the local extirpation. If you remember that most of the hunt of humpback whales was in the first decade, so that's been more than 100 years ago. Now they were subject perhaps to hunting from factory ships, also operating throughout the Southern Ocean. But if they escaped those, then they've had 100 years, certainly 56 years for full recovery. And perhaps that pulse of whales that we saw, the fact that we had recovery on the breeding grounds, but an absence of recovery on the feeding grounds, is an example of this cultural reestablishment of cultural traditions. And we have quite a bit of information on this, but one example is from a whale tagged as part of the Wild Waters Whales program in 2019, which spent the summer essentially feeding around South Georgia and then traveled north to the low latitude breeding grounds off of Brazil. So completing that link of what may have been a historical connection that was lost by that local extirpation. And so we may well see the population of humpback whales increasing off South Georgia at rates that would far exceed what we might imagine as the biological rate of increase. So in fact, they're immigrating or colonizing. That's a new habitat, not new to them, not new to the whales. Fin whales, I guess I was most struck by the fact that there were so few fin whales, given that there were 750,000 killed in the Southern Hemisphere during the era of modern whaling. But maybe that's the explanation. I mean, they were so depleted that even though they've been under full recovery again for about 56 years, the populations are still, depleted, have not had time to recover. And it's a bit of a reminder that recovery from whales can be quite variable. And in fact, fin whales are one of the species in the Southern Ocean, at least, one of the species we know the least about, in part perhaps because they're so infrequent, so rare still. Killer whales. Okay, I knew Bob was going to be here. Why so few top predators? Now, that's just my very subjective judgment. If I were a killer whale, I'd go right to South Georgia. There are 7 million fur seals there. And how many million penguins? It's just like a smorgasbord. So is it possible that there's been a cultural loss of the skills for hunting large whales during this period of extirpation of the great whales? And essentially a kind of indirect effect on the populations of killer whales around South Georgia? Or is it simply there's a lag time in population response to abundant prey? I mean, certainly that's got to be true because killer whales are very long-lived, relatively slow to reproduce. So if the population of their prey is increasing, they can't track it exactly in terms of rates of increase. They can perhaps approximate it. And Antarctic blue whales. Why so many blue whales? Well, again, relatively speaking, but compared to that period of opportunistic sightings, again, when we had no blue whales, what we saw was quite remarkable and unexpected. Susan Calderon, one of the members of our team, has actually been able to publish this already, showing that how using systematic surveys, she did a really great job of collecting up all the records from all the systematic surveys that had kept information on sightings of whales. And you can see here that starting in 1997, for 23 years, there were 1 or 0 blue whales sighted on any of these expeditions until we get here to 2019, when there were 6. But essentially, and then 38 in 2020. So essentially 80% of all the sightings of blue whales recorded were all in the year, all due to our surveys. It's similar for both the number of sightings as well as for the number of individuals. So truly a pulse, an unanticipated pulse of blue whales in the South Georgia habitat. So how does that work? Well, I mentioned this cultural loss and loss of cultural memory and sort of a regain of a tradition, but can it be aided by other behavioral attributes? For example, vocalizations. So we mentioned that we use these sonobuoys to detect the presence of blue whales in particular. In fact, the hope had been that we'd use them to detect right whales, but very, very little of the vocalizations were right whales. Most of it was blue whales. So you can see here, Susan, in fact, in front of the viewing the sonobuoy, the audiogram of the sonobuoy here, and you can see these distinctive upsweeps. Those dark blue lines are in fact blue whale calls. And it occurred to me that perhaps these are common FM modulated upsweeps, and they're typically heard from blue whales during the summer feeding season. So they're probably social signals of some kind that are not mating related. So anyway, potential that this is a kind of a dinner bell, that there's a social facilitation of this pulse of habitat recovery. Another possibility is that they aren't all Antarctic blue whales. So I hadn't told you that the taxonomy of Antarctic blue whales is quite complex and in fact is still unresolved. The Antarctic blue whale, which is recognized as a subspecies, Balaenoptera musculus intermedia, is the largest animal that has ever lived. We often hear that the blue whale is the largest animal that ever lived. That's not true. It's the Antarctic blue whale that is the largest animal that has ever lived. The longest blue whale on record is a female killed at South Georgia in 1909. She was 110 feet long. The heaviest blue whale, keep in mind that the whalers didn't weigh whales. Imagine what it would take to weigh a whale. Not until they had factory ships. So these early shore-based whaling stations of course, could measure the length, but could not easily measure the weight. So the heaviest blue whale on record was a female killed in the Southern Ocean in 1947, taken by a factory ship. She weighed 418,000 pounds. Now try to find a scale for that kind of comparison, right? How much do you think a Boeing 747, and I'm dating myself now, I'm talking about a Boeing 747. A Boeing 747 weighs about 410 pounds, 410,000 pounds before fuel and boarding. So just to give you a sense, there's a Boeing 747, there's a blue whale, similar in weight. What are the other blue whales? Well, the other blue whales are referred to generally in the Southern Hemisphere as pygmy blue whales. So they are, as the name implies, smaller than the Antarctic true blue whale. There are in fact several populations of these, one of which has been the subject of study by Don Barlow and Lee Torres off the coast of New Zealand, and is referred to now as the New Zealand population of blue whales, but is in many ways similar to the characteristics of this pygmy blue whale that was described by Japanese whalers in 1966. This subspecies is only about 72 feet in length. I say only, but still, and about half of the weight. So again, this is not the largest animal that ever lived. In fact, quite a few right whales are probably larger if we take mass to be the measure of the size of a whale. Quite a few right whales are probably larger than the pygmy blue whale. So could the pygmy blue whales now be beginning to occupy the waters of South Georgia that was previously thought to be exclusively Antarctic blue whales? And I think the answer to that is, from me, maybe. How would I tell them apart? And I think unfortunately my answer, and I've shown here an example, this is presumed an Antarctic blue whale here captured from a drone footage right off of South Georgia. This is a pygmy blue whale from New Zealand and its calf. I can't tell the difference, but if I can get a genetic sample, I'll give it to Debbie Steele and she can tell me that it's either an Antarctic or a pygmy blue whale. And so I was quite excited to have this opportunity to help collect samples from blue whales for this comparison, not only for the comparison to the bones, but for further clarification of this taxonomy. And my heart always just jumps a little bit when I look at this picture, because I've circled here in red the position of the dart. So I'm using a modified, what's called a veterinary capture rifle to deploy a very small plastic floating dart. And you can see that, blue whales, as we've already agreed, is the largest animals that ever lived, the Antarctic one, that is. But it doesn't mean that they're necessarily that easy to hit with a biopsy dart. They actually don't show, they're kind of stingy. They don't show you that much of their back at any one time, especially when you're operating from a 140-foot vessel. You don't have the kind of maneuverability that you might have in a small rigid hull inflatable. So I always look at that photograph and think, oh, I'm going to miss. But fortunately, the dart moves, the whale moves, the ship moves. Sometimes you get lucky, sometimes you have a little help, and sometimes you get and sometimes you get a sample. And you can see this is the blubber, that white on the tip of that stainless steel punch, and that's the blubber from the whale. And these are seeming to be pretty fat and happy whales, quite a lot of oil in those samples. All right, and so I've left myself just a few minutes for something I think you'll find entertaining, and I'm hoping I can get on and out of here. Oh, am I sharing? I don't mean to stop sharing. How can I boot out? Yep. Oh, yep. It's great having cinnamon here.
Maybe.
Oh, cursed ourselves. No, there you go.
But we're not sharing yet. Are you seeing that online? Okay.
Is it on?
They're not seeing it online, but we're going to play this for just a
So
second.
I think of this as a day in the life. Yi Chung is making. Rewind it, yes. I think we have to rewind it. I mean, how often do you get to hear Hank Williams, huh? Come on. Okay, thanks, Yi Chung. So yes, I think of this as a day in the life, but in fact, it was the result of many hours of video editing by one of our team members who didn't seem to need any sleep. She was Brazilian. Do Brazilians like Hank Williams? Now we have a couple of Brazilians. This is one of our crew members. Susan listening to those FM sweeps. This was an attempt to quantify the prey availability to the right whale using an echo sounder. So this is a biopsy dart on the end of a crossbow arrow or bolt, they're called. And this is a Pax arm dart, a little deployed with the veterinary capture rifle. And there's a lot of blubber on that. And here the interest was in looking at what's called the microbiome, you know, the potential for pathogens in the blow or microbes that are part of their normal environment. Don't know why the British insist on putting an A in there, but. And these are the two tagged right whales, one of which stayed for 5 months, one of which left immediately. And our incredible crew. All right, so we can leap out of that and get back to. It's that one or this one? No, it's this one. We back on?
Are we back on?
All right, well, thank you. And I have to end with a big thanks to Jen Jackson and Emma Carroll, who invited me along on this cruise, this expedition. Unfortunately, neither of them were able to make it. They had been out on the 2 previous cruises, the 2 previous years, and I think they had had a rather exhausting experience. And they had other pressing duties, so they were unable to join us, although it's a terrible shame because they miss a truly incredible experience. And so with that, I'll take any questions. Thank you.
All right. So we're going to kind of bounce back and forth between any questions online and any questions in the room, but we'll start with any questions online. Do we have any? None at this moment. Do we have any questions in the room? Oh, yes, we do. Hang on one second.
Thanks, Seth. That was really fascinating. What is the longevity of these whales? And are some of the ones that are alive today that you saw, would they have been youngsters when whaling was still going on?
So what is the longevity? I'll answer that first. It's typically assumed that we can age baleen whales by the number of rings in their vestigial ears, but it's often been called into question, one, how accurate those are, and whether there's 1 layer or 2 layers laid down. But from the best information we have, blue whales are probably living 90 to 110 years. I think we'll know a lot more about this once we have epigenetic methods for aging all the cetaceans, including the great whales. We have some of that information now for the humpbacks, and we're getting it for right whales. Blue whales are going to be a bit more of a challenge, but they're living a long time. So there are probably whales still alive today that lived through the tail end of whaling. We just had a humpback whale wash up on the shore in Sitka, a whale that we had called Spot, that I think went back, its photo identification records went back to 1973. And it was still, it looked like it was still in good health and was still reproductively active. So that was, I think, something like 47 years. So they're living a while.
All right. Any questions online? I'm just going to keep bouncing back and forth. Okay, questions in the room.
Oh, don't give it to Bob.
So I'm going to hand it to
He's
Bob.
going to ask me a hard question.
Scott, have you got any information on matches with your photo ID?
On any?
Yeah.
Oh, I think the photo ID matching has been done, probably submitted to Happy Whale, but I don't have the details of that. That was probably came in after the IWC report. So you're thinking specifically of humpbacks or any species?
Hang on.
Any of the species that you photographed?
Have you, what would they, I assume that they are, but what would they do with the killer whale photographs? Is there a central catalog for those?
We have the central catalog, so yeah, we are interested in those.
Okay. I can put you in touch.
Thanks, Scott. A couple of related questions. The first one was you were hypothesizing regarding the blue whales and noted recovery perhaps, and a potential alternative explanation that maybe pygmy blue whales might be a candidate. Are you aware of, I'm not aware, maybe I should say this way, I'm not aware of any pygmy blue whale population in the Atlantic basin.
So I'm totally speculating, in part because I like to talk about blue whale taxonomy, and this was a way to drag it into the topic. But no, one of Angie's samples has a haplotype, a mitochondrial haplivariant that is very, very common among pygmy and almost entirely absent among Antarctic blue whales. And we've raised this with Trevor Branch, who of course has got a keen interest in this, and is very convinced that it's only Antarctic blue whales. But the possibility of pygmy blue whales moving into more southerly latitudes, I mean, we know that that's true. I don't have any specific examples of it here, but I have wondered if that's a contributing factor to the sort of pulse of blue whales we're seeing now.
So the biopsy samples will eventually tell you something about that.
And it's another pitch for biopsy samples, yeah. Exactly.
So part B of the question is your catch record and bone evidence seem to indicate that there was a initial massive humpback whale population that there was extirpated, as you mentioned before. The subsequent species were starting to be taken in large numbers. And I wonder if maybe an alternative is that given the massive recovery of humpbacks, could it be possible that maybe the whalers didn't, or they rapidly switched to taking blue and fin whales and maybe left the humpbacks, so the catch record might not necessarily reflect a complete extirpation, as perhaps just shifting to the more profitable species early on, and that might explain why the humpbacks have been able to recover much better.
That's possibly true. I mean, but what's still puzzling is why so few humpbacks are reported in those opportunistic sightings. I don't know whether Susan's been able to go through all those systematic sightings, but for several decades, it appeared that there were just essentially no humpback whales around South Georgia, and it seems like the numbers have increased at a rate that I think exceed what we could expect as a biological rate of reproduction, suggesting to me there's some additional contribution coming from a rediscovery or reoccupation of the South Georgia habitat. Does that answer your question?
All right, I'm looking at Roseanne and seeing if there's any online. Okay, so nothing online. Feel free to put questions in. We've got maybe another minute or two here, but I'm going to hand a couple more for the room.
Hi, this might be an unusual question, but what was the market for whale meat through the 1960s?
It wasn't, this whaling wasn't about meat. It was about byproduct. Whales were turned into everything, essentially. Margarine, glycerin for the war effort, and bone meal. I mean, it's incredible. I mean, to imagine taking such a magnificent creature and turning it into dog food or something. I mean, fertilizer, those were all. It wasn't much to do with human consumption. Human consumption has been part of the objective primarily of the Japanese whaling, who have a long history of eating whale at least local local customs for eating whales, and then have tried to promote it as a health food, essentially, as part of their scientific whaling program, which is now a commercial whaling program. But yeah, the majority of whales taken in industrial whaling, it was just industrial byproduct.
Scott, so you pointed out when you're doing your biopsy, it's from a moving vessel and your target is moving. How do you practice for that? Do you do target practice?
Yeah, it helps the target practice, especially with the Paxarm. But how do you practice on a moving living whale from a moving boat? You don't get a second shot, unfortunately. So I hate to admit that I've missed a few. I got a few though. So, but yeah, it'd be great to have that opportunity to do more. You get into the other thing I found is over a period where you have a lot of opportunities, you do get better. You're sort of, but it's hard to have that time or that opportunity to practice in advance.
All right, we're going to take one more question in the room.
Scott, great presentation. It's great. I had a question. So when the whaling stopped, or at least when they stopped whaling, and then shifted to scientific surveys of whaling, why was that shift made? And I'm curious to know if the whaling moved to a different region, and if it didn't, were those whaling ships that were essentially out of business because there were no more whaling, those vessels, were they basically transferred into scientific whaling?
Okay, I'm sorry, I'm having a little hard time. It's a little echoey up here. Cinnamon, can you?
Yeah, I'm just trying to get away from whatever we're getting a little feedback up there.
Yeah.
So Ichang was wondering if the switch of whaling, what the purpose of the switch of whaling, whether they switched to another location.
Switch. Yes, 1965 was, I think, when the last station closed. Oh. What was the ship? Okay, well, so there was a lot of history going on around this time because whaling populations were crashing left and right. And there was a call to impose a moratorium on all whaling, right? And that happened through the United Nations. And the IWC eventually voted to accept a moratorium on all commercial whaling. It went into effect in 1986. But that was, that's 20 years after South Georgia. And by that time, the Norwegians and the UK had kind of pulled out, and the US had pulled out of whaling. And there's only a few countries like the Soviets who were whaling illegally, and the Japanese who had converted, wartime effort ships to whaling ships. There was only those countries that had an interest in maintaining whaling. And so Japan saw its only opportunity to do that by declaring this scientific whaling program. And that began, I think that began in the same year that the moratorium took effect, or maybe 2 years later, either 86 or 88. So, and what motivated that? Japanese domestic policy, I think, is what it comes down to. A lot of the whaling program there has got a very devoted kind of traditional group of fishermen who support it. And it just has a kind of it's a matter of national pride to some extent. Does that help?
All right. I think with that, we're going to let Dr. Baker off the hook. And just wanted to thank all of you for coming. I hope that we see you again next month on June 22nd for our next Science on Tap. But thank you so much for being here and being a part of this first one where we're all back. Really appreciate it. For those folks that are online, thank you so much for joining us. If there are any unanswered questions, you can find information about Scott Baker's lab and the work that he's been doing on the HMSC website, on the MMI website. So feel free to check that out if you have other questions. And again, let's just thank our speaker for this evening.
Well, thank you.
All right, everyone. Good night. Till next time.
Thanks, Cinnamon.
Storytelling voice. I could listen to you like I think you should like read books on tape.
Well, kind of you to say.
Very enjoyable.
All right. Yep.
All right, folks that are online, we're going to go ahead and end the presentation. Thank you so much for being here.